The night Ember walked away from the life she thought she was building, it was raining so hard the streetlights looked like they were bleeding. She didn't cry. She had already done that, 3 months of slow, quiet crying in the bathroom of the apartment she'd shared with Damon, careful not to let him hear, careful not to give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply he had broken her. But by the time she finally packed her single bag and walked out that door, there were no tears left. Only a hollow, furious kind of clarity. She was 26 years old, she had a nursing license, she had her grandmother's stubborn spine, and she had absolutely nothing else to show for the last 4 years of her life. She took the overnight shift at Mercy General because it paid 40 cents more per hour and because the dark suited her then. There was something honest about the hospital at 3 in the morning. People didn't pretend at that hour. They were too tired, too scared, too stripped down to bother with performance. Ember had always been good at the night shift. She moved through the wards like she belonged to the quiet, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, sitting for a moment beside the beds of patients who had no one else sitting with them. Her supervisor called her exceptional. Her co-workers called her relentless. Ember called it surviving. She had been surviving for about 6 weeks when it happened. It was a Tuesday, or technically a Wednesday, just barely past midnight, when the ambulance bay doors blew open and 2 men in black coats came in carrying a third man between them. Not on a stretcher. Just carrying him, upright, like they were trying to make him look less destroyed than he was. The triage nurse took one look at the situation and reached for the phone. Ember was already moving. The man they were half-dragging was tall, even slumped, even pale as plaster. He had a physical presence that the air around him seemed to recognize. His hair was dark and damp, his jaw was set with the particular rigidity of someone refusing to lose consciousness through sheer will alone. There was blood soaking through his shirt on the left side. A lot of blood. The 2 men with him were saying nothing useful, only, he needs a doctor, and no police, with the kind of flat authority that made it clear they were accustomed to being obeyed. Ember didn't obey them. She also didn't call the police. She assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds, determined that the man was in danger of going into hemorrhagic shock, and started doing her job. "Lay him down," she said. Not a request. "Right now, on this gurney, and get out of my way." The 2 men stared at her. She stared back. One of them, younger, with a scar along his jawline, looked briefly startled, as though he wasn't used to being spoken to like that by anyone, let alone a woman in scrubs who barely reached his shoulder. He stepped aside. The other one, older and more wary, followed his lead. The man they set down on the gurney caught Ember's wrist as she reached for his shirt to assess the wound. His grip was weak but deliberate. His eyes, when they found hers, were a startling shade of gray, not soft gray, not warm gray, but the gray of a sky about to break open. They were lucid. Frighteningly so, for a man losing that much blood. "Don't," he said, in accented English, "call anyone." "I'm going to call the trauma surgeon," Ember said, not removing her wrist from his grip, not flinching, "and you're going to let me do my job. We can negotiate everything else after you're not dying." Something shifted in those gray eyes. It might have been surprise. It might have been something more complicated. He released her wrist. His name, she learned later, was Arkady Brusilov. She didn't know that yet. In those first hours, he was just a man with a gunshot wound and an inexplicable refusal to disappear into the system the way most people did. He was conscious through parts of the surgery and unconscious through others. He was in recovery by 4 in the morning, in a private room that his associates had somehow arranged with a speed and a quiet intensity that told Ember everything she needed to know about who they were, even before she understood exactly what that meant. She was charting at the nurse's station when the older associate appeared beside her. He moved quietly for a large man. She didn't look up from her chart. "He would like to thank you," the man said. "He can thank me by following his discharge instructions," Ember said. "He would like to thank you personally." She looked up then. The man had the kind of face that had weathered things, not unkind, but carved. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between assessment and something softer. "My name is Yuri," he said, as though that explained something. He is asking for you specifically. Ember set down her pen. I'll check on him in an hour. It's not personal. It's just his turn on my rounds. But when she walked into room 412 at 5:15 in the morning, she understood immediately that whatever was happening in that room was not going to fit neatly into her rounds. Arkady Brusilov was sitting up in the hospital bed with the look of a man profoundly unhappy about being horizontal. The monitors beside him beeped steadily. The 4 in his arm was doing its work. He had the controlled stillness of someone accustomed to managing pain without showing it, the kind of stillness that isn't rest but discipline. When she entered, he watched her cross the room the way you watch something you've already decided matters. You're supposed to be resting, she said, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. I don't rest well in unfamiliar places. You rest, or you risk reopening that wound. Those are your options. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him watching her. You weren't afraid of me, he said. Earlier. When my men brought me in. I was focused. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed, noting his blood pressure, which was still lower than she liked. It's not. Another silence. Outside the window, the city was doing what the city always did, existing, grinding, breathing its particular exhaust and rain-soaked breath. Ember had grown up in this city. She knew its sounds the way she knew her own heartbeat. What's your name? He asked. Nurse Cole. I'll find out anyway. She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she hadn't permitted herself to in the chaos of those first hours. He was perhaps 35. The lines of his face were severe in the way that handsome men sometimes are, not soft, not designed to comfort, but striking in a way that felt almost aggressive. There was a scar along his left collarbone that was old and deliberate looking. His hands, resting on the blanket, were the hands of someone who had used them for more than paperwork. Ember, she said. Ember, he repeated, and the way he said it, with that slight Russian shaping of the vowels, as though he was learning the word for something he hadn't had a name for before, made her look away first. She finished his vitals. She adjusted his foredrip. She told him to sleep and meant it as a dismissal. He said nothing as she left, but she felt his gaze on her back all the way to the door, steady and unblinking, like the attention of someone who had learned to notice everything because everything had always mattered. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself this the next morning, when Yuri left an envelope at the nurse's station that contained, improbably, a handwritten note that said only, "Thank you for not being afraid." She told herself it was nothing the following evening, when Arkady Brusilov, who should, by any reasonable medical measure, have been in that bed for at least 4 more days, was not in that bed anymore. He was gone. Cleanly, completely, without drama. The room looked as though it had been carefully restored to neutral. The only evidence that he had ever been there was the note she was still holding and the particular quality of silence that certain presences leave behind when they withdraw. Ember stood in the doorway of room 412 for a moment longer than was professionally necessary. Then she folded the note, put it in her pocket, and went back to work. She thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. He came back 3 weeks later, on a night that smelled like the first real cold of autumn had arrived and decided to stay. Not as a patient. He walked through the main entrance like a man who had decided that the rules of a place applied to everyone except him, not arrogantly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had never been made to wait in a line and didn't intend to start. He was wearing a dark coat and he looked, infuriatingly, entirely recovered. He stopped at the nurse's station and asked for her by name. Her colleague Priya found her in the break room and delivered the news with barely concealed fascination. "There is a very intense man at the front desk asking for Nurse Cole," she said. "He's not a patient. He said to tell you his name is Arkady." Ember set down her coffee. She felt something move through her, not quite fear, not quite anticipation, not quite anything she had a clean word for. "Tell him I'm busy." "I told him that. He said he'd wait." "Tell him I'm very busy." Ember. Priya looked at her with the expression of a woman who had spent 3 years watching Ember work double shifts and eat dinner alone in a break room. He brought flowers. Real ones. Not the hospital gift shop kind. She found him waiting near the entrance, exactly as described. The flowers were dahlias, deep red, almost burgundy, extravagant and unsentimental at the same time. He held them with the slight self-consciousness of a man who had decided to do something he wasn't accustomed to doing and had committed to it fully regardless. When he saw her come around the corner, something in his posture changed. It was subtle. She noticed it anyway. "You left before your discharge," she said. "I had things to attend to. You could have reopened that wound. But I didn't." She looked at the flowers. "What are those for?" "They're for you." "Why?" He seemed to consider the question with genuine seriousness, as though he wasn't going to offer her a convenient answer when the real one was more complicated. "You saved my life," he said. "And you weren't afraid of me when you did it. I find that I want to know why." Ember took the flowers because refusing them felt performative, and she had no patience for performance. "I wasn't afraid because I had a job to do," she said. "That's all it was." "Is that what it was?" It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it as one. They stood in the entrance of Mercy General, the city doing its relentless thing outside the glass doors, and Ember looked at Arkady Brusilov with the kind of attention she normally reserved for things she needed to understand before they could hurt her. He looked back at her the same way. It was uncomfortable and direct, and it lasted maybe 5 seconds, which in that particular charged silence felt much longer. "I have 40 minutes before my next round," she said. He tilted his head slightly. An invitation, offered without pressure. They sat in the hospital cafeteria, which was the least romantic setting imaginable. Fluorescent lights, the smell of reheated soup, a television in the corner showing muted late-night news, and Arkady Brusilov drank terrible coffee without complaint and asked her about her work. Not as small talk. As genuine curiosity. He wanted to understand what it meant to her, what it cost her, what it gave her back. He listened in the way that people who have spent their lives being listened to rarely do, with his full attention, without waiting for his turn to speak. She told him more than she intended to. About the night shifts and why she preferred them. About the patients with no one in their corner and why she stayed an extra hour when she could. She didn't tell him about Damon. Not yet. But she was aware of how close that story was to the surface when she talked. The way everything she'd built for herself in the last 6 weeks was built directly on the rubble of something that had hurt her badly. He noticed the shadow of it without naming it. "You built something here," he said quietly. "Something that's yours." "I'm still building it." "I can tell." He looked at her over the rim of that terrible coffee cup. "That's the part one find hardest to look away from." She should have been more careful after that. She knew it even then. But there is a particular vulnerability that comes from having been broken by someone who was supposed to love you. It leaves you both more guarded and, paradoxically, more hungry for the real thing. Ember had spent 6 weeks walling herself in. Arkady Brusilov had arrived at those walls not with force but with a kind of patient, dangerous honesty, and she felt the mortar starting to crack before she'd fully decided what to do about it. He came back. That was the thing. He came back twice more over the next 2 weeks, always announced, always during her break, always with the particular quality of attention that felt like being taken seriously rather than being watched. He didn't tell her what he did. She didn't ask. Some part of her already knew, in the way you know certain things about people before they're confirmed, in the quality of how they occupy space, in the way other people move around them, in the particular controlled restraint that comes from a man who has learned that most of his words carry weight. On his 4th visit, he asked if he could take her to dinner. Not as a casual question. He asked it the way he seemed to do most things, directly, with his full attention, leaving no ambiguity about what he was actually asking. She said she needed to think about it. She thought about it for 6 hours, which was 4 hours longer than she needed and 2 hours shorter than she pretended. Then she texted Priya, who had become the keeper of this particular development with barely restrained delight, and said, "I'm going to dinner with the intense man." Priya texted back a string of fire emojis that Ember chose not to respond to. The restaurant he chose was the kind of place where the lights were low and the tablecloths were real linen and the menu didn't list prices, the kind of place that would have made Ember uncomfortable 6 months ago, when she was still calibrating her worth against Damon's casual diminishments. She wore a green dress she'd bought on sale 3 years ago and had never worn anywhere important, and when Arkady saw her walk in, the way he looked at her, unhurried, direct, with something that was the opposite of performance, she stopped calibrating entirely. Over dinner, he told her his name. His full name. He said it simply, watching her face, waiting to see if it landed. It landed. She had heard of the Brusilov name. Everyone in this city who paid attention to the wrong kind of news had heard it, whispered in relation to the docks, to the financial district, to certain buildings that seemed to change ownership in ways that didn't entirely make sense, to men who disappeared from situations they should have been able to walk away from. She had heard the name the way you hear thunder before you understand it's attached to something real. She set down her fork. And you're telling me this because? Because I'm not willing to build something on a lie with you. He said it flatly, without drama. And I think you've already been lied to enough. The accuracy of that landed somewhere deep in her chest. She sat with it for a moment. What you do, she said carefully. The things your organization is involved in. Yes. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter. I wouldn't want you to. He met her gaze evenly. But I also won't pretend to be something I'm not. What I am has costs. I know what they are. I'm telling you before you decide anything. She studied him across the candlelight. Why me? She asked. It came out less steady than she intended. Of all the people in that city. Why come back to me? He was quiet for a moment, a real quiet, the kind that meant he was actually thinking rather than assembling an answer. You looked at me in that hospital, he said finally, and you didn't see what I was. You saw that I was bleeding. You acted on that. Without fear, without calculation, without anything except clarity. He paused. I haven't been seen clearly in a long time. She didn't respond right away. Outside the restaurant's tall windows, the city moved in its relentless stream. Somewhere in that city, men operated under his name, at his direction, in ways she would probably never fully know. And here he was, sitting across from her in the particular stillness of a man trying very hard to be honest with a woman he had already decided he couldn't walk away from. I need you to understand, she said slowly, that I just came out of something that cost me a lot. I'm not in a position to lose myself in someone again. Not for anyone. I'm not asking you to lose yourself. What are you asking? He looked at her steadily. I'm asking for the chance to know you. That's all, for now. Whatever you decide after that, I'll respect. She picked her fork back up. She ate her dinner. She asked him about Russia, not about the organization, but about where he'd grown up, what it smelled like, what he remembered from before all of this. He talked about a city in the Ural region, about winters so severe they had a specific vocabulary for them, about his grandmother's apartment and the smell of black bread and the sound of his mother's voice reading to him before things had gone wrong. He talked carefully, like a man unpacking things he usually kept locked away, and she listened the way she always listened, fully, without interruption, feeling the shape of what people needed to say before they'd found the words for it. By the time they walked out into the night air, she had not decided anything. But the wall had a door in it now. That much was true. The next 3 weeks were the most complicated of her life, which was saying something. She saw him 4 more times, 2 dinners, one afternoon at a small gallery he'd bought a piece from, once walking through a park where the leaves had gone red and gold and the light had that low amber quality that makes everything feel like it's happening inside a painting. They were careful with each other. Deliberate. The tension between them was real and mutual, and they were both, for their own reasons, navigating it slowly. She told him about Damon on the 3rd dinner, not the full story, just the shape of it. The 4 years. The way love can calcify into control so gradually you don't notice the weight until you try to move. The particular silence of realizing you've been disappearing inside someone else's idea of who you should be. He listened without speaking until she was done. Then he said, very quietly, he was afraid of you. She frowned. What do you mean? Men diminish what they're afraid of losing. It's a kind of cowardice. He said it simply, not as a comfort but as a statement of fact. You're not an easy person to hold. Not because you're difficult. Because you're too clear. He couldn't handle being that clearly seen. She thought about that for a long time after. It was around the end of the 4th week that Yuri appeared at the hospital again, not with flowers, not with messages, but with the particular tight expression of a man delivering news he did not want to deliver. He asked to speak with her privately. She took her break early and met him in the parking structure, which was deserted and gray and smelled of exhaust and rain-soaked concrete. There's a situation, Yuri said. There's always a situation, she said. This one involves you. She went very still. How? He explained with the efficiency of a man who chose his words like a surgeon chooses instruments, precisely, without waste. Someone within the Bratva structure, a faction that had been growing restless under Arkadi's authority, led by a man named Stelian Varga, had been watching Arkadi's movements. They had noticed Ember. They had identified her. And they had made the calculation that a man who had started appearing in public with the same woman, regularly, consistently, with the kind of deliberateness that was conspicuous precisely because Arkady Brizalov was never deliberate about anything in public, that man had found a vulnerability. They're not going to do anything immediately, Yuri said. But they're watching. And Stelian doesn't watch things without eventually acting on them. Ember stood in the parking structure with her hands in her pockets and felt the cold of the concrete floor through the soles of her shoes. She thought about room 412 and a man with gray eyes catching her wrist. She thought about dahlias and terrible cafeteria coffee and a park where the light looked like amber. She thought about the wall with the door in it. Does Arkady know? She asked. He does now. He asked me to tell you himself. Yuri hesitated, the first real hesitation she'd seen from him. He's not going to ask you to step back. That's not, he won't do that. But I'm telling you because you deserve to know what the situation is. She called Arkady that night. He answered on the second ring, which she had come to understand was characteristic of him. He didn't make her wait. He never made her wait. Yuri told me, she said. I know. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it, something she had gotten good enough at reading to recognize. Anger, and underneath that, fear. Not for himself. Ember. Don't tell me to walk away. A pause. I wasn't going to. Arkady. I was going to tell you that I'm handling it. And that I'm sorry. That you ended up in someone else's crossfire because of me. She sat on the edge of her bed in her apartment, small, bright, filled with the things she'd assembled to remind herself that she existed in her own right, and she pressed her hand flat against her collarbone, feeling her own heartbeat. How long have you known about Varga? She asked. The dissatisfaction? Months. The specific situation with you? 3 days. And what does handling it mean? A silence that was longer than the others. It means I'm making sure you're not touched. It means I'm neutralizing the situation. It means I'm doing the things I'm very good at doing, the things that exist in the part of my life that I told you about at dinner. She understood what he was saying without him needing to elaborate. This was the cost he had mentioned. The part that had weight. I'm not going anywhere, she said. You should think about. I thought about it. I'm not going anywhere. She paused. But I need you to tell me the truth about what's happening. Not the version you think will be easiest for me. The real one. Another silence. And then, with the quiet intensity of a man handing something over that he had been holding very tightly, Varga has 3 men who are no longer loyal to me. He's been building something for about 6 months. He thinks I've gone soft because I've been seen with you. He's planning to use the appearance of that vulnerability to challenge my authority in a way that can't be ignored. What happens if he succeeds? He won't. Arkady. The structure I've built doesn't collapse because one man challenges it. But there will be consequences to how I respond. There will be disruption. It may not be safe to be near me for a period of time. She let that sit. So what are you telling me to do? I'm not telling you anything. His voice was rough at the edges now, the control wearing thin in a way she had rarely heard from him. I'm asking you to be careful. To take the protection Yuri can offer without feeling like it's a cage. To give me time to close this. And what if I said I could help? Silence of a completely different quality. Help. I'm not going to sit in a corner and be protected like something fragile, she said. I know things. I see things. I've been reading people's bodies and faces in crisis situations for 3 years. If there's anything I can do that doesn't require me to cross a line I can't come back from, tell me. Ember. He said her name like a warning and a surrender at the same time. You're asking me to. I'm asking you to let me be useful. To not make my existence in your life purely a liability. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then, there's a man. A Dr. Varga uses. He comes to the clinic on Renner Street twice a month under a false name. If you were able to tell me the next time he's scheduled, it would give me information about Varga's movements without requiring anything from you that isn't already part of your world. She thought about it. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even wrong, technically. The clinic on Renner Street was a shadow operation. She knew about it the way everyone in certain medical circles knew about it, whispered in corridors, an open secret. Passing along a scheduling detail wasn't testimony or exposure. It was information. I can do that, she said. You don't have to. I know. She paused. Arkady. Yes. Don't lie to me about how this ends. The roughness in his voice deepened. I never lie to you. That's the one promise I've made without conditions. She believed him. That was the terrifying and strangely stabilizing thing. The next 2 weeks were a lesson in living inside tension without letting it devour you. Yuri was present in her daily life in the way that shadows are present. She rarely saw him directly, but she knew he was there. She went to work. She did her rounds. She kept her head down and her attention sharp. Twice she passed information to Arkady through Yuri, the doctor's schedule, the names she overheard at the clinic when she covered a shift there, small pieces of a picture she couldn't see entirely but trusted him to assemble. In the spaces between all of that, she saw Arkady. Less frequently, the situation made public appearances ill-advised, but with a different quality. The pretense of early courtship had burned away. What was left was rawer, less careful, more honest. They talked on the phone late at night when she got home from her shift and he was still moving through whatever the night required of him. They talked about things that had nothing to do with Varga, about her sister in Atlanta and the complicated love between them, about the music he'd listened to as a young man learning that the world was brutal, about what they both wanted from the years ahead if the years ahead turned out to be kind. Do you ever think about leaving it? She asked him once. It was past 2 in the morning. Her apartment was quiet and dark except for the kitchen light she always left on. Every man who does what I do thinks about leaving it, he said. The question is whether there's anything true enough to leave for. She didn't respond to that. But she lay there in the dark holding the phone against her ear and felt the weight of what he had not quite said, sitting in her chest like something warm. The situation with Varga broke open on a Thursday. Ember was ending her shift. It had been a brutal night, 2 code blues and a pediatric case that left her wrung out and quiet the way those cases always did, when her phone buzzed with a text from Yuri. 2 words, inside now. She was already in the hospital. She stayed in the break room and waited, her heart doing the specific thing it did when she was frightened but needed to stay functional, not racing, just elevated, measured, present. Arkady called her 20 minutes later. Are you safe? First thing. The first words out of his mouth. I'm safe. I'm at the hospital. What happened? It's handled. A pause. She could hear something in the background, movement, voices, the particular muffled sounds of things being managed. Varga made his move last night. He underestimated how much information I had. Another pause. Ember. 2 of his men were picked up this morning by people who will make sure they understand what loyalty actually costs. Varga himself is, he stopped. He's no longer a problem. She understood what that meant. She didn't ask him to clarify. She sat in the break room of Mercy General with a cold cup of coffee and her hands flat on the table, and she thought about what it meant to love someone whose world contained things you could not look at directly. She thought about whether love could survive that kind of peripheral knowledge, the things you knew without knowing, the shapes you saw without turning your head all the way toward them. She thought about Damon, who had destroyed her openly and obviously and without the decency of any larger conviction. She thought about a man in a hospital bed with gray eyes catching her wrist, asking her not to call anyone, and then releasing her when she told him she had a job to do. She thought about dahlias. She thought about amber light in a park. She thought about a kitchen she had not yet shared with anyone and a life she was still building with her own hands. When Arkady arrived at the hospital, it was late afternoon, the light already going flat and gold. He came in through the main entrance again, no fanfare, just a man who moved like the air recognized him. He was tired, she could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way he carried his stillness differently than usual, with more effort. When he saw her in the corridor, he stopped. She walked toward him. Not slowly. "Are you hurt?" she asked, reaching for his hands because she had learned to read damage in bodies and she needed to check. "No." He let her look, turning his hands over in hers. "I'm not hurt." She looked up at him. His gray eyes were unguarded in a way she had come to understand was rare. He showed this only when he was too exhausted to maintain the controlled surface he usually wore, and only with her. There were lines around his eyes she didn't remember noticing before. There was the particular haunted quality of a man who had just done things that cost him something, even when they were necessary. "Come with me," she said. She took him to the family consultation room, small, private, with 2 soft chairs and a box of tissues on the table and a window that looked out on the hospital's narrow inner courtyard. She closed the door. She sat across from him and she looked at him fully. "Tell me how you are," she said. Not how the situation was. How he was. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man lowering a weight he had been carrying for a long time. "Tired," he said. "I'm very tired." "I know." "I've been," he stopped. Started again. "I've been doing what I do for 15 years. I know the cost of it. I've never questioned whether the cost was worth it." He brought his gaze back down to her face. "These last weeks, I've questioned it. Because of me. Because of what I could see from where you were standing." He said it carefully. "You don't excuse what I am. You don't pretend it's smaller than it is. But you look at me anyway, and you," he paused. "You make me want the version of things that is smaller. Quieter. More honest." She felt the truth of what he was saying moving through her like sound through water. She thought about her grandmother telling her that real love doesn't simplify you. It complicates you in ways that feel like finally getting the answer to something you've been working on for years. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with your life," she said quietly. "That's not who I am. But I will tell you what I see." She leaned forward slightly. "I see a man who is capable of building something enormous and terrible and who has done exactly that. And I see the same man sitting across from me in a hospital consultation room at 4 in the afternoon asking, maybe for the first time in 15 years, whether the enormous and terrible thing is what he actually wants." He was very still. "I don't have an answer for you," she continued. "But I know what I want. I want to keep building the life I've been building since I walked out of a door that was killing me slowly. I want to do it clearly, with someone who sees me clearly. I'm not going to disappear into someone else's story again." She paused. "But I'm also not afraid of the complicated version of things, if the complicated version of things is honest." Arkady Brusilov looked at her for a long moment. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it was something else now, something that looked like the specific relief of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long they'd forgotten that other arrangements were possible. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "That's the only thing I'm certain of." "Then start there," she said. "And we'll figure out the rest." She didn't know, in that moment, exactly what the rest would look like. There were things that would need to change, not all at once, not through demands or ultimatums, but through the slow honest work of two people deciding what they were willing to build together and what they were willing to leave behind. She knew his world had edges she might never be able to stand at the center of. She knew her own world had a particular shape, defined by those long night shifts, by the patience with nobody in their corner, by the life she'd built with her own stubborn hands out of the rubble of something that had hurt her badly. But she also knew, with the particular clarity that had always been her best and most ungovernable quality, that the man sitting across from her was the first person in a long time who had met her at the level she actually existed at. Who had not asked her to be smaller. Who had told her the truth when the truth was expensive. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the thing she had stopped believing was available to her. She reached across the small table and covered his hand with hers. His fingers turned immediately and held hers with a gentleness that seemed to cost him something, coming from hands that were accustomed to a different kind of force. He looked down at their hands for a moment, then back at her face. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "you let me drive you somewhere to eat something that isn't from a hospital cafeteria, and you sleep, and tomorrow you tell me what you actually want the next version of your life to look like." Something in his face shifted, the last of the controlled surface giving way to something underneath that was younger and less armored and, she suspected, much closer to who he actually was. "You're still not afraid of me," he said. "I'm not afraid of you," she confirmed. "I'm a little afraid of caring about you this much, but that's a different thing." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles with a deliberateness that was neither casual nor performative. It was the gesture of a man marking something real. "That," he said quietly, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 15 years. She left the hospital that evening with her hands still warm from his. The city was doing what it always did, existing, breathing, running its relentless current underneath everything. But something in the particular quality of the evening light, or in the specific weight of what had just passed between them, made the familiar streets feel like they were newly invented, full of a possibility she hadn't been able to see for months. She had walked out of a door that was killing her slowly. She had taken the overnight shift because the dark suited her. She had been in the right bay at the right moment when two men came in carrying a third man who refused to lose consciousness through sheer will alone. She had not been afraid. And now she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the full shape of yet, with her eyes open and her hands steady, and she thought about the wall with the door in it and the man who had found that door not by force but by honesty, and she thought, this is what it feels like to choose. Not to fall. Not to surrender. Not to disappear into someone else's story the way she had done before. But to choose, with full knowledge of the complicated true shape of a thing, to walk through a door that was hers to open or close. She walked toward his car. He was waiting beside it in the amber late afternoon light, his hands in his pockets, watching her come toward him with those unguarded gray eyes and that careful stillness that was, she now understood, not distance but attention. The most complete attention she had ever been held in. There was still so much they didn't know. There were still costs she couldn't fully calculate, questions that would ask more of them both than any single evening could answer. His world was what it was, large and dark and consequential in ways that extended far beyond either of them. Her world was what it was, built from her own materials, on her own terms, assembled deliberately from the rubble of something she had survived. But they were both standing in the light. Looking at each other clearly. And that was, she had decided, where every honest thing begins. Hi my loves. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this one. I mean that. This story asked a lot, from me, writing it, and I hope in the best possible way, from you, living inside it for these last 40-something minutes. Ember has been in my heart since the beginning. I needed her to be someone who had genuinely been through it, not in a dramatic, headline way, but in the quiet devastation of having given yourself to someone who slowly convinced you that you were too much and not enough at the same time. A lot of us know that particular kind of damage. The kind that doesn't leave a visible mark but rewires how you move through the world for a while. And Arkady, I know what he is. I didn't want to pretend that away or make it smaller than it is. Part of what I love about writing these stories is sitting with the honest discomfort of loving a complicated person, of asking yourself what you can see clearly and what you're choosing to stand beside anyway. Real love is rarely clean. Real love asks you to look at the full thing. What stayed with me most while I was writing this was the image of Ember in that emergency bay, not afraid. Not because she was reckless or naive, but because her job had trained her to see the person before she saw anything else. I think that's the most radical thing a person can do for another person. See them before their context. See them before their history. Just see them. If this story meant something to you, if you felt seen in it somewhere, or if Ember or Arkady stayed with you a little after the screen went dark, please let me know in the comments. Those messages mean more than I can properly say. Take care of yourselves. See you in the next one.